My name is Shadi Abou-Zahra. I work with the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, which is the organization that develops the core web standards. Those are technologies such as HTML, the hypertext markup language, or CSS and XML, and many other technologies that really drive the core of the web. Part of W3C is the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, which works at strategies, guidelines, and resources to make the web accessible to people with disabilities.
If you've never heard about the why, where would you start to learn something more about what it's all about?
We have a lot of introductory resources. We have an introduction to accessibility, linked very prominently from the homepage, from w3c.org/WAI. The core aspects of accessibility is to make sure that content can be perceived by people using different senses. So if I cannot see the content, I can listen to it. If I cannot hear it, I can maybe touch it. So to be able to perceive the content, the information in different ways. Similarly, also to be able to operate the content in different modalities by keyboard, by voice, by mouse, and by many other assistive technologies that are used. And that the content is understandable to the broadest audience possible, to make it comprehensible. And also that the content is robust, that it works across different technologies and different browsers on different platforms.
So these guidelines are global, they're for the whole world. Is it possible to have the whole world agree on these kind of things?
Yeah, so W3C Web Accessibility Initiative develops a set of 3 guidelines for accessibility. One focuses on authoring tools. Those are the tools, the software that are used to create websites and maintain them, like content management systems and HTML editors and so on. Those guidelines are called the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. We also develop a set of guidelines for web browsers and media player called the user agent accessibility guidelines, because also those tools are essential for accessibility. But most well known is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, which has been recognized internationally as the standard for web accessibility. It's also recently been recognized by ISO as ISO IEC 40500. And so it is the international standard that addresses accessibility. It's been developed through a long consensus-based process with different participation of different stakeholders from different parts of the world. So there is, of course, a challenge being able to address the different types of websites, the different contexts in which a developer may or may not be. But overall, the user requirements don't really change across borders. A person who has an accessibility requirement in one country more or less has it in the other. There are, of course, aspects that come in, such as the cost of assistive technologies or the provision of bandwidth, broadband bandwidth, and so on. But overall, the user requirements essentially remain the same across borders.
Talking about users, if you're not a developer and you're a user, what's in it for? Is there any way you can approach these? Are they too complicated? What can you use from the Y initiative?
Part of the issue that we see is that very often accessibility seems at first very abstract to a lot of the developers, mainly because many have not interacted with people with disabilities. It's difficult to understand how does somebody with no arms use a computer, or how does somebody who does not have speech abilities, how does that person, what kind of problems can occur on the website. So very often it's very vague and the user situation is not well understood. And there are 2 things that really are helping this a lot. One is the quick explosion of different kinds of devices that we see on the web today. Those really help developers understand the different use cases. It's not those big screens that they're used to anymore, but there are all sorts of different screens. There are small screens, there are big screens, there are touch screens, there are things with keyboard, without keyboard, so that it helps the developer understand that there are different contexts and different situations. The other thing is also older people and people who are using websites with in higher age. There are two very interesting things about this. First is, as we grow old, we develop age-related impairments, and a lot of the people can relate to this. It's like, oh yeah, I know somebody in my family, my grandfather or my mother or things like that. But at the same time, also, um, a lot of the people who have not grown up with computers and not had it during workspace, um, they also very often lack computer skills. So it brings in usability aspects as well, which are very interesting. So those user groups and the different devices really help the developers understand much more what it means to have accessibility and the principles of accessibility.
And maybe even developers can identify when they have to read a long text on a small mobile phone.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Being put in that position themselves and understanding that, there are some very good examples, for instance, for captioning and transcription, because a lot of the people, the first reaction is they see the cost. How much will it cost me? How much work is it to actually caption a sound file? But then when you look at all the different benefits, at how it helps people being able to find the information online, for instance, in search engines, how it helps people um, being able to read up what happened in a meeting afterwards and so on, or reuse the text in different purposes, not even to speak about translations and stuff like that that are also very useful. So, uh, and suddenly, the cost of development really outweighs or is much lower than the benefits that are in consequence of such accessibility features.
So the last question I have about users is that uh, how user tests is talked about a little bit, I guess, in these guidelines, and how do you think that can be achieved in the best way? Are there are there any good advice on user testing?
Testing with users is really recommendable, is really something that is very useful. Again, for the aspect that it helps explain to a developer right there what the issue is. When it's an abstract, there's a missing text description or something that doesn't really click. But when they see a user um, struggling um, and not being able to find the information that's right there, it's just not marked up properly, it really makes light bulbs go up in the developer's head. So it's a very powerful promotional tool. At the same time, also the users can very well articulate what kind of issues that they perceive that they have. On the other hand, one must also say that it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between preferences of a user and uh, perceived um, uh, issues. For instance, the problem could lie in the browser or in the assistive technology or lack of knowledge about the features in the assistive technology on the side of the user, which doesn't make it better because practically it's still not accessible, the information, because they're not able to use it. So it's a two-edged sword. It's something that is quite difficult to do properly, but it's something that we always recommend paired with the guidelines, because the guidelines don't bring in the representation of just one user. They bring in the perspectives of many users and combine those different uses, those common needs of the different users in condensed guidelines and condensed requirements. So using the requirements along with user testing together usually yields the best results.
Okay, thank you.